Hello, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with you today for your English 11A live lesson. Now, this lesson is going to be on 2.4, which is the fourth lesson in the second unit for English 11A, and this one's entitled American Gothic Literature. Now, I know some of the last lessons we've gone over have been pretty long and arduous, and this one is a little more simple, just going into American Gothic style. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen so we can get started. Oh, wait, hang on just a second. Okay, all right. I wanted to make sure that I was recording. Okay, so we start off on slide 5 with elements of Gothic style. So they pretty much lay all of this stuff out here for you. They give you the vocabulary words and what these things mean, and they do it in a very short sort of way. Each one of these definitions is definitely just one or two sentences, if even that. So they go through foreshadowing, genre, imagery, mood, protagonist, sensory detail, setting, and unreliable narrator. All of these definitions are given to you in pretty plain language, so I'm not going to read through every single one, but I will stop on a couple that I think might be a little more difficult to understand. So with genre, that's the second one here, we've got the classification of literature characterized by particular content and form. So basically, a genre is a category that you expect to have certain features. So I wanted to give you an example of this just to refresh your memory on what this is. So genre works similarly, not exactly the same, but similarly for movies as it does books. So for example, when you think of a horror movie versus a action movie, you know what you're generally going to get and expect. That's the characterized by particular content and form sort of things. There's a set of rules that these types of movies tend to follow. And it's the same thing for books. Within genres of literature, you get stuff like mysteries, you get things like Gothic style, which is what we're going over today. We get things like sci-fi or fantasy. You know, if you're reading a sci-fi book, things are going to lean a little more towards technology in the future. If you're dealing with fantasy, you might end up with someone who's in a different world or who can do magic. The fact that you can hear the words fantasy and sci-fi and expect certain things, that's what makes it a genre. Now, the next one, imagery. I feel like imagery is a simple one. It comes up a lot. It's been coming up since the English 9 courses, but I do think that the way they phrase it here makes it a little difficult to swallow, so I'm going to go over it. It says descriptive language that relies on sensory details to help readers imagine the setting, characters, or detail of a story or poem. So basically, imagery is when you use language to help people picture what is in your book. So instead of just saying, there's a box sitting on the floor, you could add detail. You can say the box sitting on the floor looked worn with use. It had frayed edges, and the brown color that it once had when it was first acquired now has a sickly gray hue and has been worn down by dozens of fingers touching, moving, and ripping it over time. So at that point, we've got a picture of what this box looks like that's even more than just picturing a standard box in your head. They tell you that in this sentence, it's old and worn. It's frayed. Frayed means that the edges are rough, like the material is coming up. So that's what imagery is. It's when you give more and additional detail to the description of something so that people can picture it accurately in their head. Let's see. We've got after this, mood and protagonist. I think those are pretty straightforward. Sensory details. So a lot of sensory details are used as imagery, but it's important to be able to identify them by themselves. So the difference between sensory details and imagery is sensory details is just you picking out parts of imagery that make it imagery. So when you point at a phrase that says frayed edges, you can say, oh, well, this relates to touch. You can imagine that the material feels rough. That's a sensory detail. So usually you use sensory details in imagery, but the sensory details are the little pieces on its own. And the last one I want to go over is the unreliable narrator, because I think this is one that people don't think about a lot. Basically, an unreliable narrator is when you have someone telling the story and you can't trust the details they're giving you. Sometimes people will write characters that are actually just difficult to trust. So like if you know that a villain is telling a story about a hero, they're going to call the hero really awful things and say terrible things about them. And they may be unreliable. They want you to think that the hero is awful. Some books will do this because there will be a twist at the end where maybe the hero is actually awful. An example of this in terms of movies would be like Emperor's New Groove, for example. Yzma narrates part of the story and she paints the picture of Cusco, who is the main character, being awful. But when you actually see him in action, being a terrible emperor and not caring about the people's wishes, the twist is that even though Yzma's trying to take his position from the like and steal the throne from him, he actually is awful. It's only through trying to avoid being assassinated by her that he grows into a person that actually isn't that bad. So it's important to, when you're reading a book, ask yourself, has this author or has this narrator, whoever is telling the story, has this narrator given me reason to not trust what they are saying? Are they in a situation where they could be lying about what's happening, about the events? So they go into, on slide 6, a little more information about the background of Gothic style from the Middle Ages. So basically, the word Gothic comes from the architecture, that means the style in which buildings were built, from the Middle Ages. So that included stone walls, tall pointed ceilings, narrow towers, and stone gargoyle structures, all of which provided the perfect setting for frightening tales. So those kind of old haunted castles that you picture from horror movies, that's Gothic style. And there was a whole writing style that was dedicated to writing stories set in those scary places. So for those of you who might watch this, think of like scary castles from Scooby-Doo, or the haunted like rich person's house that people have to spend a night in to win a certain amount of money. You know there's something bad going on there. The place gives you weird vibes. People have died there was a tragedy there or something. The kind of stories where the setting tells you what's going to happen, like if you know that bad things happening at a place a long time ago means that nothing the main characters are going to go through is good now, that's how you know you have a Gothic setting. That's part of the Gothic style of writing. Now, they give you a little more detail. From the 1700s to the 1800s, Gothic novels gained popularity in Europe first and then the United States. And these works describe mysterious atmospheres, like we were talking about with the houses, with protagonists who became entangled in terrifying, ghastly, and perplexing circumstances. So this was basically horror before horror, with a little more sophistication and detail, basically. Now on slide 7, there is a video here. It's only about 5 minutes long. It's a little shorter than 5 minutes, that gives you the rundown on Gothic literature. It's a really good video and it'll actually help you out with understanding things. So take time to take a look at it. You can take a lot of notes about Gothic literature here, and it's pretty much anything that you would need. Okay, so our reading selection is going to come from Edgar Allan Poe, because they want to give you an example of what American Gothic literature was like. So we're looking at Edgar Allan Poe's work. So this first section gives you information about him. The important things that are listed here are that he was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1808. So that tells you the time that he was active. They tell you that he wrote for a literary journal. He published a novel, just one, but lots of short stories and also lots of poems. He's known mostly for his Gothic poetry, but he has actually written a novel. He's definitely considered one of the most influential writers of American Gothic literature. That's what he's known for. Whenever you hear Edgar Allan Poe, you think Gothic. Um, he explored violent plot lines and like sort of dark, secret supernatural stuff in his story. He wrote a lot about people slowly descending into madness for different reasons. And his fiction is regarded as basically the precursor, that means like the predecessor or the thing that came before modern mystery and horror games, because he wrote a lot about people going places they shouldn't be to try to find out information about stuff and then being swallowed up by really awful circumstances. And if that's not basically what the horror movie genre is, I don't know what is. So he's pretty much the father of that. Let's see. So the story that we're reading is called The Cask of Montialdo. Sorry. The Cask of Montialdo. So basically, this was one of his short stories. And they pretty much give you questions to consider while you are actually reading this story. What does the story display? How does the story display characteristics of the Gothic style? If you are looking at this question and you don't know how to compare it to Gothic style, that means that you did not watch the video from the previous slide. You need to go back and look so that you can actually compare this to the questions. How does I'm sorry, based on the clues for foreshadowing, can you predict what Montresor, that's one of the characters, will do to Fortunato? So they want you to keep this in mind while you were reading. Once you get to the point where you know who Montresor is and who Fortunato is, they want you to try to make a prediction about what's going to happen before you get to the end. And then it says, identify one of the puns that Poe uses in the story. So they give you the definition of puns if you click that link. Yeah. So they give you a whole knowledge article on puns. But generally, a pun is a verbal play on words that are identical or similar in sound, but different in meaning. Puns often rely on homophones and homonyms to create verbal irony. So it's basically when you use a word that sounds the same, but has a different definition to make a joke. Most people know what puns are. So for example, they give you one down here. I've always thought of archery, that's the practice of shooting arrows, as an aimless sport. So the pun there is that there's aimless and quiver. She said with a quiver at the end. So aimless is ironic because you actually physically have to aim when you're, pulling an arrow back. You have to physically aim. So to call it aimless is ironic. But they mean aimless as in there's kind of no point to it because no one really uses it these days. So she's using the pun of those definitions, kind of going against what archery is to create a joke. And then it says, she said with a quiver. So a quiver is like when you shake, when you shake because you're shivering or you're scared, that kind of thing. But a quiver in archery is what you keep your arrows in. It's like a little narrow basket with a handle that you can put over your shoulder, and it's what you keep your arrows in. So they're making jokes here because of the way archery works, and they're using the words aimless and quiver. So they want you to keep an eye out for wordplay like that in this story. Okay. So here they start to give you the analysis. I don't go over excerpts in these. If you want help with understanding the excerpts, feel free to schedule tutoring. But they do go over a few things that I want to point out here. So there's some stuff from the video about Gothic literature that you can find here. There's a lot of elements that this shares with Gothic literature. This is basically a Gothic story. And a couple of those things are that the main protagonist is mentally unstable, and that the setting is in that sort of bleak cave underground area. And the setting that the story takes place in sets the mood for the entire story. That's a Gothic thing. When you're in a dark, dank, awful place, and the point of being in there is to foreshadow what's going to happen, you know nothing's good is ever going to happen there. That's part of Gothic literature. There's also that the home of Montresor is described as having vaults, a winding staircase, and damp grounds. So even outside of the underground area that they go in, his home is still an awful place. Anyone coming to visit him is not going to turn out well. And then there's also some of the imagery. A lot of the imagery just sort of makes things seem scary, ominous, which means like just the overarching feeling of bad things happening there. And the backdrop for like what's going to happen. So in this slide, they describe it as macabre, which just means like very dark and foreboding, like very sort of scaring. You can tell that it's just going to be grisly and not great, you know, maybe even violent, just sort of dark in a eerie, scary kind of way. That's what macabre means. And I mean, that's true. That's pretty much, they describe it that way on purpose. And Gothic literature goes out of their way to describe everything in the way that the reader is supposed to feel throughout the story. So on this slide for 15, they talk about foreshadowing. Basically, you know, we talked about this earlier with the earlier slide, foreshadowing. Just in case you didn't go over it, it's when you put clues in the story to let people know what's going to happen before it actually happens. So like you can throw in an image of a trap or something that looks suspicious. And once the main character gets close to it and decides to examine it, man, they get caught. You can kind of tell based on how someone describes those details, whether or not they are actually going to like fall prey to something like that, or whether or not they're going to be affected by it. That the story creates tension by letting you know that something bad is going to happen. And it pretty much comes down to you being able to, you having to sit there in the feeling basically of something bad being about to happen. This happens in horror movies all the time, where you can see, for example, where the killer is hiding, and you know that that one of the characters is about to run right into him and probably get murdered, but you have to sit there and watch it after you know. And that's a sort of tension where you're just like, just do it already. That's the kind of tension that foreshadowing creates by giving you the clues ahead of time and making you wait to see it actually happen. So he does this in the book, and they give you an example of it here on this slide. And they give you an example that includes a pun, and then they explain it at the bottom. So this is pretty straightforward. And I think that it's pretty easy for you to get the point of the pun and also understand what the foreshadowing is while you are reading this here. Okay, actually, I think that that's it. There's a couple more pieces to this lesson, but for the most part, this is it. So the focus on language here, it's been a couple lessons since we've had a long focus on language, and this is pretty short. So this is a word and part of speech for all of the words here. My advice is always to write down the word and the part of speech because it can't hurt, and to write down the definition of these words. If you need help with pronunciation, you can include that. I think that you should include it for words that you know you're not going to remember. But if you think you got it, you can probably go without that column. The other parts of speech you only really need if you think you're going to have a hard time remembering this word in general and how it can be used. Remember that nouns are person, places, or things. Adjectives are ways to describe things. And verbs are the action verb or the action word version of that thing, when you can say that someone is doing a thing. Now here we also have colons. So colons are the two dots So like boop, boop in a straight line. And they give you rules about how to use colons here. So they start off with some concepts they want you to be familiar with. One of them is literally the colon. I just explained what it was. He went to the store to buy these items and this double dot here stacked on top of each other. Preceding a list, that is the colon. Now, a dependent clause, basically it's a group of words. It says here that contain a marker, so that they mean a marker kind of like a comma or something like that to separate it from part of the sentence. And it contains a subject or a verb. So basically a dependent clause, to explain how it works, because I know that that probably didn't help the way they wrote it out there. A dependent clause is a section of a sentence that has a subject. So that means that there's a person involved, and a verb, and it tells you what that person or thing is doing, right? And it's a section of sentence that cannot be a sentence on its own. So they give you an example here. Until I finish eating. Until you finish eating what? What are you doing until you finish eating? It's not a full sentence, but it has the subject, which is I. That's a person or thing, a person, place, or thing. And it has eating, which is a verb. So it's telling you what that person, place, or thing is doing or what is happening there. But it's not a full sentence. So you can't say that it's a full sentence. And that's why it's called a dependent clause. A shortcut for remembering stuff like this is to remember, if you're a dependent, it means you're relying on someone. Dependent clauses have to rely on the rest of the sentence to make sense. It's not a full sentence on its own. And that means when we move down here for independent clause, an independent clause expresses a whole complete thought. And it's independent, meaning that it can take care of itself, right? That's what that means. So it's a section of sentence that gives you a full thought. It is a complete sentence. Think of an independent clause as a complete sentence. A dependent clause is not complete. It needs other parts of a sentence to make sense. And then they give you phrase. A phrase is a group of words used as a single part of speech that lacks either a subject or a verb. So a phrase is basically when you have to put multiple words together to refer to one thing. So the example they give you is Jamie, a studious girl, wanted to do well on the next test. So they describe Jamie as a studious girl, not just a girl, but they give you a descriptor so that you can understand what kind of girl she is. The fact that you're using more than one word to describe Jamie, but it all has to be together for the description to work, is what makes it a phrase. A studious girl is a phrase. That tall building is a phrase. Instead of knowing the name of the thing or using the name of the thing, you're using a description of it to refer to that person, place, or thing. So that's what a phrase is. Now they give you some other words, some other examples here about the rules where you use colons. So it says in written text, colons are used to punctuate salutations in business letters, to denote the time, or to denote reference in some religious texts. So what they mean, salutation in business letters, when you say to whom it may concern, colon. So you're letting them know this message is to who it might concern. And you use a colon to tell them, here's the message for whoever it is that's listed at the top, to whom it may concern. So whoever is relevant, here's the information. To denote the time, so when you write 9:30, there's a colon in between. And then for references in religious texts, if you're quoting Deuteronomy 13:12 or something like that, you use a colon between the chapter and the verse name. So that's what those explanations mean. It says for clarity in writing, colons are often used in sentences to indicate that related information will follow. So basically, at the end of a complete sentence, you can use a colon to let someone know, and I'm going to give you more information about this. You can say something like, the sounds she heard were eerie, and then you can add a colon and then list the actual sounds. Wailing far off in the distance, the scraping of nails on a chalkboard, and a suspicious growl whose direction couldn't be placed. So you already know that the noises are creepy. That is a complete sentence. The noises are the thing, and what they are doing is being creepy. But by giving examples, you're giving related information about what kind of creepy sounds those are. So you can use a colon between the complete sentence and the examples as a list. And down here, that's pretty much what they tell you. A colon can be used to introduce a list. Colons often follow phrases such as follows or the following. So they're giving you a hint of where you might see a colon after as follows or the following. And then they give you an example. Matthew's new car was equipped with the following features: a sunroof, a temperature regulated leather seats, and a navigation system. So they're telling you that if you're listing something after giving someone information to give examples, you use a colon there. And then they give you some examples of things not to do, incorrect ways to use them versus the correct way. So be sure, if nothing else, write down the examples. I would underline these. So colons are used to punctuate, and then I would make a list. Salutations and business letters, they're used for the time, and then I would include the time as an example. So if you look at it later, you know. And sentences, I'm sorry, and religious text. And then I would use an example. That way, if you're looking at this later, when you're going through the final, if you get a question about colons, you can see your own examples there from what I discussed, and kind of it'll click for you a little easier. I would also write down these incorrect and correct usage. That way you can compare the wrong usage to any of the answers you might get to pick from on a test. It says a colon is also used between two independent clauses when the second clause summarizes or elaborates on the first. So basically, if you have two sentences and the second one gives you more information about the first one, you can separate them with the colon. So they give you an example here. Michelle had one more task to complete before attending her daughter's graduation the next afternoon. That is a complete sentence. They tell you exactly what she's doing. She has another task to do before she goes to her daughter's graduation. But they give you information on what that task is. She had to order a cake, which is a complete sentence on its own. But this tells you what the task is that's being referred to in the first sentence. So you can separate them with a colon. They are related and giving you information about the previous sentence. And then it says, similarly, a colon can be used to introduce a quotation, but only when the quotation consists of an independent clause. So if the quotation is a complete sentence or a complete set of sentences, you can use a colon to introduce what someone is saying. So you could say something like, here's what Cardi B had to say about this scandal. And then you can say a colon and then actually quote what she's saying. But what she's saying has to be a complete sentence for you to be able to use it that way. So they tell you right here, the importance of using a colon is that it tells readers important forthcoming information. When you spot this punctuation mark, consider this type of information the author is trying to emphasize. So when you see it, you know they're giving you something extra, and you need to know or know to take a look at what you think the extra information is and how it's related to the previous part of the sentence. It might be foreshadowing, it might be a list of details about a character. Just a colon is used to emphasize important information. The rest of these slides are questions about colons. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Okay, this was a pretty short one. Just pretty much the reading selection, a little background information, a video, and the colon stuff I think was the most difficult out of all of that. If you are having issues with your with understanding the excerpt, like I said before, or with understanding colons, you can book a tutoring session. You can do that by contacting your advocate or your mentor. We also have a section on colons and how to use them in the English concept summary, so be sure to look at that. If you don't have access to the concept summaries, please contact your advocate. Step Up students don't have access to the resource course, but you can get linked to it by asking your advocate. If you have a quick question, please email the English department at english@atsedu.net, and we'll answer your question as quickly as possible. But other than that, I think that's it for today. This is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with your English class.